when I grow up.
Hello and welcome to our podcast on the genre of the musical. Now, ideally, you have watched our original genre overview podcast that kind of sets up what exactly a genre is, and you've learned the idea of how these genres have their patterns and have their evolution. And then this is going to be just a more specific look at one genre in specific, and that would be the musical. Now, if you haven't watched that original overview, don't worry, this isn't that big of a deal. I'm sure you can figure this stuff out. So if you want to find out most specifically about the genre of the musical, go ahead, watch on, and see if you can deduce what we're talking about in terms of the genre of musical. So what is a musical? I think before we talk about musicals in film, it's a good idea to back up and look at the musical as a piece of live theater. And so for our class structure, the way we talk about it is film has a literary level, and these are the things that film has in common with literature or the written word, such as characters, theme, motifs, foreshadowing, etc. We then look at the dramatic level of film. What does film have in common with live theater? And this is where we have set design, actor choice, costuming, etc. And this is where many musicals originated. We had, before movies, we had live theater. And so we have the elements of the play moving into the idea of vaudeville in the early 1900s, this idea of kind of slapstick comedy on stage. We then have vaudeville with more music, and then we get the American musical, which is definitely a unique piece of literature in the American canon, something that America has created to add to the idea of the arts. As film took off, we were able to see the appeal of musical theater and the appeal of going to the movies, and some very enterprising people put those together. And they were able to say, if people will go to a dark theater to watch people sing and dance, why won't they do it on film? And the answer was, of course they would do it. And so the musical genre is interesting because it has its roots way before film, but the idea in film is very similar. The story is told through song and dance. As a genre, we're okay when a character just stops what they're doing and sings about it, or when the characters stop and do a little dance. That would not work in the sci-fi genre, the western, the gangster genre, those kinds of things. In the musical genre of film, we're used to that because it stems from the live theater version. So what are some of the rules of this genre? We're going to see theater terminology. Again, it's extension from the live theater idea. The setting of many musicals is in a theater. Not all, and we'll talk about the differences between these, but it is usually pretty normal in a musical movie for people to break into song and dance. Again, it wouldn't work in other genres, but because the rules of this genre accept that and the influence of music and singing and dancing, that is how the story is told, and that is the pattern of the musical genre. So at this point, we kind of have to differentiate a little bit in terms of the types of musicals and how those show up on screen. The first one is the idea of the backstage musical. So these are the musicals where the live stage theater are kind of the setting, where the storyline revolves around the creation of a musical, the inner workings of a musical, the actual stage production. So something like Fame. The movie Fame is about the school and the kids involved there being on stage. Something like Moulin Rouge, kind of a backstage musical where most of this takes place on stage in a theater. It's just the idea of taking that live theater aspect, putting it on film. This can be somewhat contrasted with the idea of a straight musical. And so what we mean by that is the setting could be kind of anything that any normal movie could be, but just every once in a while, people stop and sing and dance. For example, The Wizard of Oz. We don't see a play's staging. We don't see curtains. We don't see the wings. We don't see all the lighting that goes into it. But for whatever reason, in this kind of fantasy musical, all of a sudden characters will stop and sing along the yellow brick road. The Lion King, Oklahoma, South Pacific, all pretty similar to this. South Pacific, telling the story of World War II on this little Pacific island. But sometimes the characters don't want to just tell somebody they love them, they need to sing it. And so this becomes the idea of the straight musical, where we have just regular old movie with song and dance thrown in to advance the story. So going back to some of those items that create cohesion within a genre, one of the ideas is the theme or thematic issue of a genre. And consistently within the musical genre, we see the idea that ambition is rewarded. And so if it's a backstage musical, that could be that a new person has joined the cast, kind of the underdog, somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing. They've come to the big city to join the theater, and they tend to be mentored by an older veteran. But usually that younger up-and-comer gets the part in the end. The lesson is, if you work really hard and stick your neck out, that might be a good thing for you. Romances tend to end happily, and high ideals are justified. Another pattern of the genre is the idea of iconography, so the images that pervade and weave in and out of different films within a genre. Some examples of that might be the idea of backstage. These are all the inner workings of a real live theater stage. The ropes, the weights, the curtains, the wings, all the control panels back in the wings that we don't normally see. In a musical film, we might be privy to those. We can actually see how characters move about on a stage even when they're not in front of the audience. We might see dressing rooms. We might see the wings of the theater. In a film musical, we might be able to see how those actually work. Obviously, singing, dancing, those are common pieces of iconography. And also, like I mentioned before, the star and the up-and-comer. Usually there's some new person who's joining the show, joining the troupe, joining this creation of live theater. They come in, they're not very good at first, they are mentored by the veteran or the star. There's usually some sort of competition between the two. And then we tend to see the star eventually give up their role and allow the up-and-comer to take over that role. This would be the idea of iconography that we see over and over again in musical genre films. The mood of many musical genre films tends to be relatively positive, despite the examples I've got on the slides like The Phantom of the Opera and Moulin Rouge and Chicago and some of the others. Many of these tend to be very positive. Happy ending, romance is achieved, they live happily ever, that kind of stuff. We're also able to see characters overcoming obstacles, so that up-and-comer faces his or her challenges, excels over them, and then earns the role by the end. So in terms of a cinematic style for the theater genre, we have to go back to those two subsets. In a backstage musical, the film itself is going to look very much like a live stage production. Sometimes it's from the audience's perspective, as if we're just watching the stage. In terms of the lighting, we might be privy to some of the spots and cams that they use in stage lighting that we don't normally see in film lighting. We just see the effect, we don't actually see the light itself. Contrast that with the idea of the straight musical, like The Lion King or Frozen. They look like any other movie, the same types of shots and camera movement, angles, etc. It's just that every once in a while, characters break into song, and that creates a little bit different feel than your normal cinematic experience. So at this point, if we go back and look at the genre throughout its whole evolution, we have this various stages of the genre. We always start with the primitive stage, the earliest films that dabbled in this idea of mixing singing and dancing with film and telling a story that way. Here, patterns, themes, iconography are all created and established. The people who made the Jazz Singer and Showboat weren't out to create some sort of 50-year pattern. They just said, we've got a story to tell, we want to tell it this way, we think this would be the most effective way to do it, and they made a movie. As more people thought that that was a good idea, more movies were made like that, more people attended movies like that, and the pattern is established. We then get the classical stage of the genre. Patterns continue. Many people become interested in this genre and they turn out in droves to see them. Singing in the Rain, My Fair Lady, Cabaret, Wizard of Oz. A lot of people like these types of movies, and they like this pattern. They know that there's going to be some sort of toe-tapping song somewhere in there that is able to progress the plot. Like all genres, the musical genre goes through the idea of the revisionist stage, where it looks like the musicals we've seen before, but the stories, the themes, the ideas become a little bit more complex and ambiguous. Look at the example of Black Swan. It has all of the makings of a backstage musical. The fact that we see the wings, that we see her creating a show that will go on stage. We see the direction, we see the pit, we see the rehearsals. This is stuff that most of us don't normally see when we go to a theater production. But this movie shows us all of the elements that go into the making of a theater production, which is a backstage musical. But if you've seen it, it is exceptionally gray and ambiguous and complex. Who's good, who's bad, who's the up-and-comer, who's doing well, and who's not. It's very complicated compared to some of the simple movies that come earlier in the genre, but it still has very similar iconography. It's just a little bit later in the genre's evolution. Like all genres, at some point we get people who make a parody of that genre, and we enter the parodic stage of that genre, and this is where it is mocked. Themes stay the same, iconography is similar. We're going to get the backstage musical feel in a movie like The Producers, where they're trying to create a musical that will fail in one night. We also get the straight musical example, still in the parodic stage, with Rock of Ages. Here it's telling the story of some people in a musical bar who are trying to raise money to save the bar from destruction, and they, of course, at times just sing and dance at will, which is kind of crazy, but it's definitely making fun of all of these other musicals. You're not supposed to take this seriously. The characters are outlandish, the backstories are ridiculous, a lot of great comedy in this, but it does fit the idea of a parody while also fitting the definition of a musical. And then eventually we have the idea of the extension of the genre. The values and themes reappear from that basic stage, but things may be slightly different and divergent. So for me, I have a really hard time looking at this part of the genre's evolution and saying this is the extension, because the movies that I kind of think of that would fit in here might be something like Footloose or Forgetting Sarah Marshall, because characters do just randomly break into song in Footloose, and Forgetting Sarah Marshall, kind of the guy's job is to create a stage musical. At its heart, those films are still within the regular core and evolution. They're not completely changing the genre. So if you can think of any musicals that have completely diverged from the original pattern but still retain some tiny elements, let me know, because that would potentially be the idea of the extension of this genre. And so that's it for now in terms of the genre of the musical. As you're thinking about these films, think about all the great overlaps you might see or feel in terms of Broadway shows. How are those produced in live theater? And then how do we transpose those into film? What's the iconography of these? The idea of the staging, of lighting, of the backstage, of the new person coming in, clashing with the established veteran. Those patterns evolve throughout this genre, and it seems to be a pretty popular genre. Whenever Disney puts out a new movie, such as Frozen, that movie tends to do pretty well. And I think it helps because we have song and dance involved, and it adds a whole nother layer to the film experience. But at its root, the musical genre still follows the patterns of the generic genre. It has icons, it has themes, it has moods, it has cinematic style, and those evolve and change with time, but still go back to their roots when convenient. So as always, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please bring those into class. We will see you soon and get those taken care of. Thanks.